Let's go back in time to October 17th, 1814. We're in London, in the parish of St. Giles, and a disaster is about to strike. But this isn't a fire, or factory explosion, or anything you might expect. No, this catastrophe was a flood of beer. And we are not talking about a small spill here. We're talking about over 323,000 gallons of dark, heavy porter erupting from a brewery and flooding the streets. That's more than 1.2 million liters. It's a staggering amount of liquid, almost impossible to even picture. So what did it actually look like on the ground? Well, people who were there described something truly terrifying. This wasn't some gentle spill. It was a violent, 15-foot-high wave of beer, and it was moving fast enough to just sweep people off their feet, carrying them away with all the debris. So the big question is, how on earth does something like this even happen? Well, the answer was sitting inside the Mickes and Company brewery, where a supposed marvel of technology was really just a ticking time bomb. You have to understand, this was industrial-scale brewing on a whole new level. The brewery used these absolutely colossal wooden vats to ferment its beer. I mean, we're talking about tanks so huge they held millions of pints worth and literally towered over the entire neighborhood. But here's the crazy part. This whole massive operation had a huge weak spot. See, these giant wooden vats were held together with heavy iron hoops. And on that fateful day, just one of those hoops, a single 700-pound ring of iron, snapped. And that single failure, that was all it took. You see, inside that vat, the fermenting beer had been building up this insane, invisible pressure for months. All that kinetic energy was pushing outwards. So when that one hoop failed, the pressure was released with the force of a small explosion. And from there, things went from bad to catastrophic in the blink of an eye. The first vat didn't just leak, it completely disintegrated. The blast wave from that was so powerful, it set off a domino effect, shattering several other enormous vats nearby and unleashing the full scale of the disaster in just a matter of seconds. But, you know, a massive engineering failure is only half the story here. The real reason this industrial accident turned into such a deadly human tragedy has everything to do with where it all happened. This brewery wasn't out in some industrial park. Nope. It was crammed right up against the St. Giles Rookery, a notorious slum, just packed with families living in the most desperate poverty you can imagine. This was a residential area, home to some of the most vulnerable people in all of London. And the way this neighborhood was built turned it into a perfect death trap. First, you've got the wave itself, powerful enough to crush anyone in its path. Then, the back wall of the brewery collapsed, turning bricks into deadly projectiles. And the most heartbreaking part, many of the poorest families lived in basement cellars. When that wave of beer hit, those homes filled to the ceiling in moments, leaving absolutely no chance of escape. So let's talk about the human cost. Because behind all the physics and engineering are real people whose lives were just destroyed in a matter of minutes. The official count came to 8 people killed. Now, I know 8 might not sound like a huge number by today's standards, but for this tight-knit, super poor community, each loss was devastating. And when you look at who these victims were, it tells you even more. The disaster struck in the afternoon, when most of the men were out working. The people who died were overwhelmingly women and children, caught completely by surprise in their own homes, like one mother and her daughter who were just sitting down for tea when the wave smashed through their wall. But the story that just absolutely captures the horror of that day took place on New Street. In a small basement, a family was holding a wake, mourning their 2-year-old son who had just died. The flood crashed into the middle of their grief, killing the boy's mother and several other mourners. It's an almost unbelievably tragic detail. You'd think the story ends there, right? When the floodwaters finally receded? But the tragedy was far from over. The aftermath? Well, that's where you see this shocking story of injustice and a legal system that had no idea how to deal with the dangers of this new industrial age. Amidst all this horror, something really strange started happening. The story goes that hundreds of people rushed out with pots, pans, whatever they could find to scoop up all this free beer from the streets. It was this bizarre mix of desperation and opportunism, and there were even reports of people dying from alcohol poisoning over the next few days. But let's talk about actual justice, or really, the lack of it. The official outcome here is just stark. For the families of the victims, they got nothing. No money, no compensation, nothing. But for the brewery owners, not only were they cleared of all blame, the whole thing was ruled an act of God, but they actually got a massive tax refund from Parliament to cover the cost of the beer they'd lost. Unbelievable. So you're probably asking, how is that even possible? How did they get away with it? Well, the truth is, a disaster like this was so new, so completely unheard of, that the legal system just didn't know what to do. The whole idea that a company could be negligent, that it was responsible for the safety of its technology, it just wasn't a thing yet. So what's the takeaway from all this? What's the legacy of this absolutely bizarre disaster? Well, it remains a really grim but really important cautionary tale from the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. In the long run, the flood did actually spark some change. The brewing industry eventually, slowly, started to phase out those giant, unstable wooden vats for much safer materials like concrete and steel. And if you're ever in London on Tottenham Court Road, the Dominion Theatre now stands on the exact spot where that brewery used to be, a modern landmark sitting right on top of this hidden, tragic history. Ultimately, the London beer flood is this incredible reminder that progress often has hidden costs, and new technologies can create dangers that nobody sees coming. It was a cautionary tale back then, and it kind of leaves us with a question for today. What are the massive, fermenting vats of our own time, the unseen pressures building up just out of sight?